My colleague, Connie McNeely, professor in the School of Public Policy, and we have a very distinguished panel today. Let me start off. We are rearranging the panel order a little bit. Vaughan, Turekian, Director of the Center for Science Diplomacy at AAAS. We'll start with putting science diplomacy in perspective. Martha overview. Mary F. Smith, President of the Iraqi Women's Fellowship Foundation, to give us sort of I don't want to say real world, but on the ground view of an effort that's advancing science diplomacy. Linda Staheli, she is Senior Staff Associate at CRDF Global, will give us reflections on science diplomacy from an organization that has many efforts to advance diplomacy with countries with whom we have, shall we say, challenging relations. And we have Dr. Matt Gerdin, Foreign Affairs Officer with the Office of Science and Technology and Cooperation at the U.S. State Department. We'll be talking about cooperation, collaboration, trust, case for science as diplomacy and statecraft. I will provide the wrap-up, and in the short time we have, science diplomacy is problem, prospect, and promise.
Okay. Well, thank you, and thank you all for showing up. It's a great thing to get people actually show up on a Friday afternoon. The term science diplomacy, right? It's sort of a funny term. We think about two totally different worlds when we think of science and diplomacy, and yet it's actually a terminology that has become probably more prevalent in the way that people are thinking about dealing with broad international issues. That interface between science and diplomacy, and when people think about the merging of those two terms, really what we tend to think about is actually three levels or three different categories of science diplomacy. We think about the role of science in diplomacy, right? The critical role that science plays in underpinning decisions that are being made in the foreign policy world. And so, right now there's the climate change conference going on in Doha, and a lot of the discussions being taken place at the foreign ministry level are taking place because there's a science that underpins a lot of the foreign policy decisions. It's true for almost every other global issue that one can think about. Is there's a big science element. That's science in diplomacy, the role of science in informing diplomacy. There's a second piece, which is that role that diplomacy plays in helping science. And having been a scientist for some part of my life, you know that it's oftentimes big science requires people getting together, and oftentimes that means countries getting together to pay for things. And there's big energy projects or big physics projects that really require not only the scientists to feel comfortable with what the basic science is that's driving the agenda, but the diplomacy and the diplomats getting together and sort of arguing out and hammering out a final agreement that sort of helps set up something. So the CERN project is probably one of the great examples of the important role that diplomacy, interface between diplomacy and science, in helping build something that turned out to be a multi-nation, multi-stakeholder basic research experiment. And finally, the one that we spend a lot of time thinking about, which I think we're actually going to hear a lot about today, is the issue of science for diplomacy. Really the role that science plays in helping build relationships, bridge relationships, and bridge places where the relationships are actually quite strained oftentimes. And so, for lack of a better term, we've coined something we call the 3 E's of science diplomacy. I apologize. We do things in 3, right? I went to an Episcopalian school my entire life, so or my entire childhood, and everything was sort of the Trinity. So the 3 E's, the three things. So here we are, the 3 E's of science diplomacy, and the way we describe the 3 E's of science diplomacy are first expressing. The first E is expression. So science to express national power or influence, and really that's not just a U.S. thing. In fact, the expression of national power or influence is actually almost uniquely, strategically, not a U.S. thing, even though the U.S. science community has used or the U.S. has great ability to express power through its science. It wasn't actually a strategy. There are countries, and I think about colleagues in New Zealand and Brazil and other places that are actually trying to develop strategies for how they can use science and science cooperation to express national influence beyond their borders. And so the chief scientific advisor for the government of New Zealand often talks about the fact that New Zealand is a really small country. Most people know about New Zealand either because they think about hobbits, or they think I thought I was going to Australia. And he always describes it that way. And what he describes is that actually science is actually a really key way, because they've made some tremendous discoveries, particularly in the agricultural biotechnology and some of the things around greenhouse gas mitigation, particularly from livestock, and that their science actually gets them out into the world and sitting, as he describes, sitting at the same table as the big guys, the big countries, when you're talking about climate negotiations, because they've actually are a developed country that thought about this. So it's a way for New Zealand to express its national power and national influence. The Brazilians are doing this more and more. I don't know if people are following something called the Scientists Without Borders, where basically President Dilma has decided that she's going to send out tens of thousands of young Brazilian scientists around the world to get trained, to sort of serve actually as ambassadors of Brazil out to predominantly highly developed scientific communities and develop those links. Again, another way to express a country's national power. The second E that we think about is one called equipping the foreign ministry to deal with technical issues. That's the second E. And as I mentioned sort of at the start, one need not look too far to see that almost every single foreign policy issue that that countries address have science or technology or its applications embedded into the way in which you have to operate. I worked as a science advisor to an Undersecretary of State a few years ago, and every issue that was coming across the desk had someplace embedded in it science or its applications. You know, avian influenza pops up, and almost immediately you have to start thinking about the science basis for it. You talk about energy, sustainability, climate, any one of these issues, but even going further, countries developing their own, how you interface with the country around innovation. An innovation agenda is often a science agenda. So it's equipping, what you need though is you need to actually have some capacity within foreign ministries to even be able to conduct these discussions. So science diplomacy is actually a way to equip the foreign ministry for science diplomacy. The last E is the one that we actually do spend a lot of time thinking about in the U.S. and actually at AAAS and my colleagues here, CRDF Global and others, is enhancing bilateral and multilateral relationships. There is almost no doubt that the history of science and scientists is being tremendously important in building bridges, particularly where the political relationships, or often where the political relationships are lacking, is well documented. One need look only at things like the U.S.-China relationship. That even before the official relationship with China, the People's Republic of China had been codified in 1979. For decades before that, the movement of scientists back and forth provided an important link, an important understanding of the two communities. In fact, when Nixon went to China, during that famous Nixon goes to China moment, they did the Shanghai Communique. And in the Shanghai Communique, the important political part was driven by the identification or the recognition of a U.S. one China policy. The part that actually spoke about building a relationship that went beyond the geopolitical and into the societal had underpinning it the role of science and scientists in more exchanges. And there are some impacts of that and some results of that we see even today. But then the one that people talk about almost constantly in our science diplomacy world is the U.S.-Soviet relationship. The U.S.-Soviet relationship, even at the time when the political relationship was almost going nowhere, the enhancement of bilateral relationships and understanding and connections through science cooperation are well documented and well known. My father was actually part of some of the early teams that went from the U.S. to the Soviet Union to sort of start those scientific exchanges outside of government. My mother really stuck it to him because when he came home after one flight, he not only had a wife and 2 kids, but he also had this dog that was going to stick with him for the next 15 years that he just sort of had this love-hate relationship with. And that's what happens when you leave too long for these science diplomacy visits. But that was actually a well-documented case. But today, sort of flash forward, and a lot of the ones you're going to hear about and the ones that we've been participating in, and some of them are the role that science has played in trying to build some connection, some link, even when the political relationship is minimal. So the enhancing of bilateral relationships. And in our own case, and with Linda and her organization and a couple of others, we've worked to try to build some connections with North Korea, and Linda will go more into that. AAAS has had for a while now, and more actively recently, an effort to try to engage with the Cuban scientific community. Again, a country that's extremely close, but for almost 60 years has had very limited interaction with the U.S. But the scientific communities actually can find some really interesting things to work on, particularly around this use of shared resources and shared boundaries. I mean, when you think about the Gulf oil spill, the concerns about what was going to happen not only with the oil, but the knock-on implications for things like fisheries, because a lot of the warm current, which is where a lot of the fish species are spawned, that actually are sort of important game and trophic levels of fish, are actually in that region just north of Cuba, sort of between the U.S.-Cuba boundary. I remember, and then there's some other places. One of the most promising ones is actually the U.S. relationship with Burma, and well before the U.S. relationship with Burma sort of moved to the level that the president was actually going to visit, AAAS had science delegations going back and forth to have some conversation and to find some areas of commonality. And then another one, which our colleagues at the National Academy of Sciences have really been spearheading, is the U.S. relationship with Iran. Probably one of the trickiest relationships geopolitically to date. And yet, the respect and admiration for U.S. science and the degree of proficiency of Iranian scientists is such that when you get the scientific communities together, there's actually pretty neat overlap. I show this, and I don't have a black, I'll ruin this TV if I draw on it, but one of my favorite graphs that I ever saw was in, and I'll do it right here, and you can. Okay, so it's going to be almost impossible to see this, but if you can, what you see is you've got this numbers. This is numbers of scientists, and this is year, and this year is actually 1979. It's actually 1980. And you look at a line that goes like this, right? So one line starts up high numbers, and it just drops down pretty quickly. The second number here kind of comes up and shoots up very quickly. Those two lines actually are pretty indicative of the implications of political relationships on science relationships. So this is numbers of students studying in the United States, or numbers of students studying in the United States, and mostly it was in science. The top line, the one that sort of drops off, is actually the number of Persian or Iranian scientists. The bottom line is the number of Chinese scientists. And the inflection point, which is great, right? Which you always look for these things in science, is inflection points, is actually, and it's actually 1980. And if you think about what happened in 1979 is when the two events happen, right? So we know about the Islamic Revolution in Iran and the immediate drop-off, and then you know about the second piece, which is the China in 1979, the official welcoming or recognition of China-U.S. relations when Jimmy Carter signed the normalization pacts. And the first thing he signed was an S&T agreement that actually made science cooperation and exchanges easier. What this gets down to at the end, so I'll finish off here, is science has always been affected by and affecting foreign policy. And science diplomacy, the role of science diplomacy, and particularly the 3 E's of science diplomacy, are key to understanding that interface between science and the conduct of foreign policy. I'll finish there. And by the way, for those that don't know, we have a publication. This is the public. It's all online. It's actually called Science and Diplomacy. It's online to anyone who wants to see it at sciencediplomacy.org. Registration is free. All the content is free, and it's we welcome people to read it, but also to think about articles to write, because we really want to get this field moving forward.
Take questions? We'll have Mary.
I'm sorry.
There will be a chance to grill people at the end. However, Ron is going to be leaving, so this is the opportunity to grill.
Okay, yeah.
What opportunities have the internet provided in work in science diplomacy?
It's a great question. I think overall, just generally in science, international science, you can see, one of the things my organization does is we publish the journal Science, and you can see the numbers of international collaborations in papers between 1990 and 2005. In 1990, about 30% of papers that were published had international authorship. By 2005, that number is up to about 65%. One part of it, one could say, is because you just have more international collaborations, there's more science in more places. But really, if you look deeper into the numbers, it's the ability for people to communicate more rapidly because of science, that you can actually have those collaborations even if people aren't meeting, because they can share manuscripts back and forth, it's just easier to collaborate. at the end of the day, the other thing that the internet and any social media has done is it's actually provided more and more focus on sort of almost speed dating in a way, right? You find a way, you begin to look out for people that are interested in the same topics as you do, and you can do a matchmaking much more easily. So that's probably the easiest. Yeah, sorry.
Question for you. The presentation that you made, I guess it's been obvious worldwide that science has a role in diplomacy, but what you need to do is teach the people in the White House and in Congress who always use sanctions and conflict as a way of dealing with issues. That becomes, that is always, has always been, I mean, there was a time in the United States, the same thing to India too.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you can list a period, and suddenly it becomes very friendly to them.
Right.
And so, given that, I think it's U.S. that needs to understand this and practice it, because we all know that bad things also happen in science diplomacy. So, the United States and Soviet Union built up a huge arsenal that was also science diplomacy. Then went into Cold War science diplomacy.
Well, I mean, I don't think science diplomacy was the reason why they built up huge arsenals. In fact, there's some, I think, pretty good writing that says that it was Pugwash that actually was very influential, and that was bringing together scientists from both sides in understanding from the two different sides outside of the official. I mean, the beauty of sitting in the cheap seats is, well, I'm not in government, so I don't, you don't think about those things, but the scientific community oftentimes has had the ability to have those conversations and figure out how they can get up to policymakers. And I think Pugwash and a number of other organizations and a number of other interactions were really critical in getting the science community to inform the policymakers about some of the concerns that you mentioned about these things. There's another example. I was talking to Ambassador Negroponte about science when he was the assistant secretary in charge of the Science Bureau at the State Department, and sort of spoke to him since then. And he was saying one of the amazing things was you look at the Montreal Protocol. The Montreal Protocol to ban CFCs or deal with the ozone layer was truly a science diplomacy case. It was because the scientists were able to go make the discovery about the ozone harming of CFCs, but also communicate that with trust to their colleagues, and those colleagues could then communicate that to their decision leaders, that you actually, even in the late 80s, could get the Soviets and the US to sign on to the same global treaty. I mean, that was a science diplomacy victory to actually address a global issue. So I think the scientific community, we shouldn't be Pollyannish. The science community is not going to solve every problem, but it is a very powerful way to keep people having some dialogue. The question of how then those dialogues can actually get into society are actually really important questions, and they do have, and we've had lots of...
One more thing I wanted to ask you is, you used the term American science one time, because I've been here for a short time, I don't know how many times. This used to be a very common refrain in America in the early 70s, the Western science, as if everyone else doesn't have something. Everybody only has a science. So that also creates a lot of
absolutely.
problems.
The American funded science, I mean, the challenge, of course, is that...
As if the West owns this.
No, I think anyone who sort of looks at it, science is a global enterprise. There are parts of, I mean, every science is done everywhere, and you find it quite easily in places. The challenge is that when you have a system or something that's global in its scope, so science is global, but it's still being run mostly by national funding systems that are sort of national in nature. One of the challenges is, how do you scale from a national systems into a global entity? Subra Suresh at the National Science Foundation is doing a great job of trying to see how do you begin to bring together research councils from around the world, because the research councils are going to be focused on their national entity. That's just sort of thing. But how do you actually get them to become more coherent and compatible to actually sort of scale up to some sort of global scientific community?
Question on science and inequality that it creates in the developing world, because when most collaborations between US universities and universities, developing countries, happen with elite schools that are already well funded and have the talent, and that causes their standards to rise, and it creates a lot of resentment among students who are working in less privileged universities.
Yeah.
How do you handle that, or how do you deal with that?
Yeah, that's the question of it's not inequity, it's divergence, right? Like how do you move, because you will get divergence. You see that almost in any system where the elite will tend to couple with the elite, and that can leave behind other things. I mean, we see it even in universities here, right? There's sort of this stratification that begins to take place. One of the things that people begin to look at more is how do you help countries or work with countries and learn, by the way, too, because there's some things that are really important to science cooperation is only good if it's two-way. It can't be one way. It's not development. Science is not development, right? Science is cooperative and collaborative. But one of the questions is what are sort of the things that have worked in terms of developing a science system that might be applicable to figuring out how to engage underrepresented communities. So, I mean, that's a concern that people think about from a policy standpoint in the U.S. How do you engage underrepresented communities and get more people involved in science and access to the scientific communities and the benefits of science? It's true when you're speaking internationally. What are some of the things that have worked? The Brazilians, I mentioned that they're Scientists Without Borders. Well, and a whole other part of their concerns are trying to figure out how do they reach out beyond the coasts and bring up the science literacy in the parts of Brazil that actually are not at the same level, so you don't get this huge stratification. And that is conversations about science policy, but also training the trainers and education, and also figuring out how you keep the scientific method embedded into things that also meet societal needs, so people see the direct benefit of the science.
And the reason, I'm sorry, the reason is that so societies are much more unstable. So any changes in increase in inequity makes them more unstable.
Yep.
And when the social problems are
absolutely.
So the problem is here as well, and in all societies like that. But the risks to the social stability and social fabric is much stronger.
And one of the things one has to be very careful about in the science, so now sort of switching to pure science diplomacy, is that if you're only working with the elites, you have two problems. A, you're not really addressing some of the big problems, but the other problem is you can tend to disengage the elites, even though they think they're doing the right thing by engaging with the U.S. around science issues or other countries around science issues, but they become decoupled actually from society as a whole, and you can actually get a resentment that builds up. And so one of the things around science communication and science engagement, and so things like working on science centers and museums, things that actually demonstrate the value and the importance of science, not only to the scientists that might not be at the same level, but broadly to science as a society, then it provides value. People see there's a benefit in doing this engagement with the U.S. science community. It's not all negative. And the example I use with Burma is we were very cognizant of that. You can't just work with the people that were trained overseas and went back to Burma. You have to actually think about the role that science can play in improving parts of society like forestry and health. Sorry.
No, part of this is good. Your question will probably apply, but I can answer that later. Excuse me. I really thank Vaughan for giving me a great context on science in diplomacy in which to talk about the Iraqi Women's Fellowship Foundation. I think that my role here is to really describe one sharply focused example of science diplomacy at work. The Iraqi Women's Fellowship Foundation brings Iraqi women in science and technology to top universities, such as Berkeley, Stanford, Caltech, and so on, for up to 1 year study and research internships. The Iraqi women return to Iraq, all of them, with an entirely new outlook on their fields, cutting-edge knowledge, and new understanding of teaching methodologies and research methodologies. They also enrich the STEM programs of the U.S. universities where they're placed. And they build cultural understanding and experience, which really becomes a two-way street. When I met this year's MIT fellow in her lab, she was part of a research team that was working on the use of cellulose or renewable material in lightweight structural engineering. Her idea was to make use of the marsh reeds in Iraq in the composition for structural engineering. She was working with a team partly based in Sweden that was also looking into the use of potatoes. She realized that every moment was precious and was trying to make the very most of it. When I asked her about the political situation in Iraq, she said, and I won't forget this, "The political situation will change. It never stays the same, but the impact of education on the people and the differences that professors make will stay forever." She ended by saying, as we have all our fellows so far, "We are strong, we are able to laugh and to create. We all love our country." A little later, I'm going to review with you the significant contributions that these women are making on their return to Iraq. Now, because I'm limited in time, I'm going to skip over a couple of slides here. This one, well, I'm not going to slip over this one. This was Secretary Clinton's poignant remarks about the importance of equal rights for women in terms of advancing democracy and prosperity. She said, if half the world's population remains vulnerable to economic, political, legal, and social marginalization, our hope of advancing democracy and prosperity is in serious jeopardy. The U.S. must be an unequivocal voice in support of women's rights in every country, on every continent. The IWFF is focused on two critical needs for democracy and development in Iraq: women's empowerment and expertise in science and technology. So let me first turn to the role of Iraq's women today. Women have benefited from a long tradition, as I mentioned earlier, of equal rights for all Iraqis. In one of these slides that I skipped over, I have, no, it's coming later, there. These are all the events, and I have PowerPoint extras to hand out to anyone who wants them afterwards. But in any case, they have enjoyed a long tradition of equal rights to education and employment. In the 80s, Iraqi women were among Iraq's top doctors, lawyers, engineers, and scientists. However, during the last half of Saddam's regime, women's rights were restricted, and they could no longer hold senior positions either in academia or in the marketplace. And many of the educated women self-schooled their children in their homes. These restrictions have now been reversed, but there have been rollback efforts. The 2005 Constitution, now in effect, accords equal status to men and women, including equal rights to education, to employment, to vote, and to run for office. However, there is an article declaring Sharia law as the highest law in the land, so that no law can override established rulings of Islam. Thus, women's rights are really precarious, and they need support both from within Iraq and from the external community. Iraqi women have a very important role to play. Let's get up to date here now. This is where they were. They have an important role to play. They are barometers of success and stability in their communities, recognized as coalition and peace builders, recognized as forces of stabilization and social reform. They have achieved constitutional reform and parliamentary reform, and they now have the right to a 25% of the seats of parliament. They have that quota established for them by law. There is a very critical cadre of educated professional women. All but 20 of Iraq's universities, which in Iraq's heyday were distinguished for their engineering and science prowess. All but 4 of those universities have engineering schools and schools of computer science. Iraqi women also make up the largest part, 2/3 of all government employees, and a select number are at the Director General level. As you will see in the next screen, Iraqi women have a very high labor force representation in education. You can see the blue line, the light blue line in education. That is the percentage of Iraqi women in education. In agriculture, the light blue line below, they are non-wage agrarian laborers, which the country is trying to diversify away from, and that's another subject. Women account for 52% of the population and over 1/3 of university students and 1/3 of its academics, university academics, but they still only hold 13% of the labor force employment. In a moment, we will review the experience of our IWFF fellows as leaders, professionals, innovators, consultants to the public and private sectors, and they are role models for the next generation. So let's now turn to the role of science and technology in Iraq, its needs and scarcity of supply in terms of local expertise. Public sector needs, I think we have all read about. Unreliable electricity is at the top of the list. The World Bank did an investment climate survey using a pool of 700 plus firms in 2011, and 75% of those firms, 79% of the households, all indicated that electricity, lack of electricity, was the #1 problem that they faced, even higher than security. There are frequent interruptions in water supply, a deficient road system, and frequent breakdowns in telecommunications. So infrastructure improvements are just essential to stabilize the country, to support private sector-led growth, social reform, and democracy. And Iraq requires local expertise to support the rebuilding and development of its infrastructure. The private sector is suffering from the same infrastructure constraints that we've just noted. They also have, in the World Bank survey that I referred to, they have listed in political instability and corruption as the #2 and #3 constraints. Private sector, outside of the oil economy, which is unto itself, but only contributes 1% of total jobs in Iraq, private sector is stagnant. The need to diversify and to create jobs in high productivity, high value, technology savvy firms in Iraq is just essential. But it also does not have the skilled workforce right now to support that kind of development. So what is the role of IWFF? We are embarking on our 4th year of bringing Iraqi women in science and technology to our top universities. And these women do not disappoint. Here are their success stories. You can, I have these as handouts, so you don't have to strain your eyes on this too much. But the fellows have been in all different disciplines. The first in electronic and communication engineering. She went back and has worked with Cisco Networking Academy and held her faculty job. Second one was is a PhD in power engineering, then somebody in information technology, industrial engineering, chemistry and computer science, and lastly, civil engineering and laser electronics and communications engineering. So these are, as you can see, they're well educated to a limit, but what they learn in coming to these different universities and spending a full year working with colleagues, with faculty, performing research, working in teams, which they have not done usually. It enables them to develop leadership skills as well as important knowledge to take back and to use as building tools in their country. So what have they been doing on their return to Iraq? One of them has established a first renewable energy research facility at our university. Another heads the Cisco Networking Academy in Iraq. Another one is training in GIS control of power distribution, reestablishing a PhD program in engineering, developing the field of environmental science. Interestingly enough, Caltech was interested, they really limited their selection to someone who would be able to connect with them over the long term in developing the field of environmental science. And I should say that one of the good parts of these fellowship years that these women have spent is that they have developed ties, long-lasting ties that are supported by the internet and permit some program collaboration that I am sure in the coming years will be expanded. They've advanced the internet, what we are talking about, the internet, and one person is managing the first laser institute for medical and industrial applications in Iraq, and these institutional ties are really important. So we stay in touch with our fellows when they return to Iraq, and they with us, and they with each other, developing an alumni network. And they send us updates from time to time. And they're really interesting to read because the long-term benefits from their exposure to the U.S. educational system and culture is evident. We talked about the power engineer and what she has been doing on her return to Iraq. The other fellow here, I think what she says is interesting. She says, the most important thing I am doing is changing my way of teaching, and really I am noticing a change in my students' way of thinking and studying. I am also interested in encouraging myself and my colleagues in our research work to fulfill our country's needs. Now that is really what this is all about, so we like getting that response. So what are the critical factors of success? Partnering. We think building capacity is what we're after, and we seem to be succeeding. Institution building, we are developing the universities which themselves suffered under the last 15 years of Saddam's regime by not being permitted to have any access to outside world. And we have developed very important partners with the Iraqi government, with the US government, with US and host and Iraqi universities, with the private sector, with NGOs, and of course with the qualified participants themselves. So where would we like to go? We're building a pool of talented and qualified scientists and engineers who return as leaders, innovators, and professionals, and their role models. We are interested to size up, scale up to meaningful size, and to build on the early success, and to continue to build partnerships. If you are interested, please contact us. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to need some help here. Bye, Vaughan. Have to chat with you later. Okay, I need to go to my PowerPoint presentation, which is... okay, so I'm going to try to stick to the 10 minutes here, but I just want to say thank you, Mary. That was really inspirational. I've met some of those women. So my name's Linda Staheli. I've worked in this area as a non-scientist for about 23 years in the U.S. government at State Department, the White House Science Office, NIH, and for the last 12 years at CRDF Global. I was going to try to just give some reflections, knowing that Vaughan would sort of set the stage on science diplomacy, and Matt would talk about the U.S. government and state, just what I've observed over the last number of years and where we are with CRDF Global's work. And I want to thank Connie and Jason this. So I need to learn how to figure out how to, there we go. So I'm not going to talk much. I'm going to flip over a lot of these slides because we've already addressed this. But when I think of science diplomacy, I think about that's a catch-all for science, engaging scientists, engineers, innovators, entrepreneurs in making bringing ties between countries that can be for the purpose of building science collaborations or for building relations between countries, addressing security challenges that we have, and helping build prosperity and peace. And I would say that on our website at CRDF Global, we have a whole section on science diplomacy, and we have a lot of resources. We put together a bibliography of a lot of resources, and there needs to be more research done in this area. So I really encourage all of you to think about that. Because I think of science diplomacy, that coined term of science diplomacy, is a relatively recent, last 5 or 6 years used. In the old days, when I worked in the government, we called it international science cooperation. I'm sure others still call it that, but and I'm not going to. Everybody here knows about the history here of what's happened globally. I wanted to just say, for Vaughan's not here, but he's had a huge influence in this area. He set up the Center for Science Diplomacy. He didn't mention it. About 2008, has a science diplomacy journal. I think he wrote some of the first articles coining science diplomacy. Has helped with a number of trips. Let's see. In the last, in the 90s, when I worked in this field at the State Department and OSTP, we really focused on building bridges between our technical agencies, and the role of the private sector back then was not as active. And I think that's shifted dramatically in the last 5 or 6, 10 years. In addition, there was very little funding, and there's still not a lot of funding, but I think we're more creative in how we build partnerships than we used to be. So in this, I think things really changed in when this role of the science advisor came to the State Department. I think it was 2000, when Norm Newrider came as the first science advisor, and we really started to develop champions. And I think Secretary of State Colin Powell started to talk more about science and the importance of international science engagements. And since President Clinton came on, he has spoken about the importance of this area in his speech to the Academy of Sciences. Secretary Clinton has been much more engaged on this, and of course we have, a number of scientists in the administration, and many of them, as you know, from NSF to AID, are very involved at the very top levels. So we have new champions, and that's one of the developments that I wanted to touch upon. In addition to the executive branch leadership in the State Department, Science Advisor's Office, and OES has always been involved in this for many, many years. But we also, in the last 6, 7, 8 years, I think, developed the Science Envoy program. And that was, I think, an executive branch initiative that Senator Lugar on the Hill helped sort of move forward. But we've got a number of senior scientists as champions, and maybe, Matt, you'll be saying a little bit about that. But I think that's helped in terms of elevating the importance of this with our own government, but also with the publics, not only in the United States, but globally. I've worked for the last 8, 9 years on our congressional outreach at CRDF Global with my colleague Beth McCollum, who's sitting in the front row here. We have worked very hard to educate members of Congress and staff about the importance of bringing the scientific community together with the policy world. In 2008, Brian Baird, a congressman from Washington State, held hearings, I think for the first time, on international science collaboration. There's been legislation that he introduced, and also the chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, Berman, introduced, that we were involved with on science legislation, international science partnerships, and global science diplomacy. So there's been, I think, enhanced appreciation for the value of this on Capitol Hill. Scientific organizations, clearly, I think there are just so many more, and with the internet and a greater appreciation for the value of scientists, engineers, and entrepreneurs in addressing global challenges and how that can address and help build greater peace and prosperity. But I think scientists themselves have become more in tune with this, and I think AAAS and other organizations like the Academy have had to help, and the Carnegie Institution, I would probably add to that. Private sector, NGOs, universities. Just the other day, USAID launched a huge university initiative. NSF, I guess just the last couple of days, has been taking some of their programs and enhancing them globally. So there's a lot of exciting developments. CRDF has been actively working to help build this appreciation for the importance of science diplomacy. We've had a number of events in town on Capitol Hill. We have an annual dinner that honors our founder, George Brown, who was the chairman of the Science Committee. We put together a statement on science diplomacy that I can circulate if you'd like, maybe if you want to just pass that around. This we did about 4 or 5 years ago with the Partnership for a Secure America and with AAAS to try to get, our public more engaged in understanding the value of this, and we had events around the country and had op-eds and that sort of thing. We put together science diplomacy media boot camps for journalists at CRDF Global. We've done 2 of them for about 50 journalists. We've worked hard on the legislative congressional front. We called for, and when we testified on Capitol Hill in 2008, we called for a global science fund. And that was sort of not specific, but it was raising the importance of needing more funding for international science collaborations. And I think there have been many efforts to try to do that, and I think there's been some successes. I'll say a little bit about CRDF Global. We just moved a couple weeks ago. That's our new building. We don't have the whole building. But we do occupy 1 floor. We're growing. We have about 150 staff in our headquarters here in Arlington and 4 offices overseas. And we're created by the Congress through authorizing legislation through the National Science Foundation about 17 years ago. We call ourselves a do tank. We are focused on building and implementing international science collaborations, working closely with our sponsors and our supporters, including much of our support comes from the State Department. Our impact, you can read this, but we have worked through research grant competitions and trainings and through our institution building programs and our security and solutions programs to set up a number of centers globally, 50 centers through our basic research and higher education program. We conduct a lot of trainings. You can read the statistics. I'm not going to go through that too closely. I wanted to highlight a couple of our programs. The Virtual Science Library is just one of a handful that I've been personally more actively involved with through my North Korea work, which I'll talk about in a minute. But a AAAS fellow helped us start, a few AAAS fellows, I think, helped us start this a number of years ago with Iraq. And now we're working in over 10 countries. Basically, we go in and set up a server where we're able to help the scientific community there access the thousands of scientific journals that we've negotiated with publishers for them to be able to access free of charge. So we set this up with working with the U.S. government, implementing it with Iraq. We passed over the management of this program to the Iraqis a number of years ago. We're working in Central Asia. We've set these up in Algeria, Tunisia, Morocco, Armenia, and we're hoping to set one up with the North Koreans this next spring. One of the other programs that I love is our intensive English training camp, where we work to give scientists, and usually they're young scientists, and we've set up about 14 of these camps in the Russian Far East over the since I think 2002. But we have helped these young scientists learn how to present their presentations globally more effectively. The Global Innovation Through Science and Technology Initiative, which we work closely with OES, CRDF implements it, is focusing on entrepreneurship and innovation and developing the next generation of innovators globally, working in about 40-plus countries. It's helping to implement the Cairo Initiative. It's been extremely active, particularly in the last year, with a number of boot camps and competitions and mentorship programs. We brought the finalists from a recent competition to the United States this last month to 4 cities where the 18 finalists were able to go to Silicon Valley, Boston, New York, and D.C. to be able to network and mentor and connect. And now our team is in, I think, Doha for the Entrepreneurship Summit. And then finally, one other example, I'm just giving you a few quick samples of some of the things we've worked on at CRDF Global, is something that I helped get off the ground with AAAS Vaughan. and with Syracuse University and the Korea Society and the Pacific Century Institute as an engagement consortium with North Korea, and Science as a building, as a bridge. We work closely with the Academy of Sciences. This took place after many years of consulting through the UN mission and bringing the mission ambassador to AAAS meetings in Boston, Chicago, and in San Diego, and really having them interact with our scientific community to sort of learn and appreciate, as foreign policy experts, the value of science. This led to being invited to Pyongyang, where Peter Agre led a delegation of us there in 2009. This is the picture on the upper right. And we had a very successful week-long visit that resulted in an agreement. We agreed to bring a reciprocal delegation back to the U.S. The following year, which we did, brought them to Atlanta, Georgia, and they met with 10 U.S. universities in Atlanta. We had a whole set of meetings set up with the Carter Center and Georgia Tech and Emory, and a number of universities flew in for that. But what happened after that is we got some funding from the private sector. Again, this is a non-governmental consortium to fund 2 capacity building efforts, one in developing a virtual science library and the second in English language. And as a result, we hope to go back to Pyongyang in the spring to get the virtual science library implemented. This last year, we brought the North Koreans to Bellagio, Italy, to help further build the relationship. So that's just a small example of one of the many things we're doing. And I know time is very tight, so concluding remarks, just the importance of building champions, the need to continue to cultivate private sector engagements and partnerships. Much more of the funding will be coming from the private sector with our tight fiscal environment in the United States and elsewhere. Making sure that we have data and impact in our work, and leveraging the diversity of talent, whether it's women or young people, and the resources that are out there. So I thank you very much. Sorry about that.
Okay, I know we are short on time, so I'm actually going to make a few brief remarks, building upon what all the other panelists have said, and then hope to fill in any gaps with any questions you may have. Again, I'm at the State Department in our Office of Science and Technology Cooperation. I think it's been articulated the key roles that science diplomacy can play, but I want to add to that the economic perspective. Vaughan talked about innovation. At the Science Department, our science offices are now reorganized under a directorate of energy, environment, and economics. And Secretary Clinton has stated that science, engineering, technology, and innovation are the engines of modern society and a dominant force in globalization and international economic development. So with that, we have a much greater economic lens. Coupled with that, you have the global landscape of science changing, emerging from traditional centers in Europe, Japan, and North America, with countries like Brazil, India, and China. And then when you look at the global challenges that we're facing that are based on science and technology, you see this nexus come together where you can see how science engagement can advance foreign policy objectives that have been alluded to, economic prosperity, democratic governance, empowerment, inclusion, as well as advancing U.S. scientific leadership. President Obama has a great interest in us maintaining U.S. scientific leadership, having our students engage around the world. This mimics the global economy. The best science isn't housed in the United States. And with that, at the State Department, how we really work to advance science diplomacy, I think can be binned in 4 different areas. The first is bilaterally, government to government. We have over 50 science and technology agreements between the U.S. and other countries. This provides a framework for engagement. We also have numerous strategic dialogues with countries that have an S&T component. Second one, through public engagement. Linda highlighted the Science Envoy program, where we send eminent scientists around the world. We also have numerous science public diplomacy partnerships, the Science Technology Innovation Expert Partnership with 10 scientific professional societies using their members to travel around the world and engage foreign audiences. Third, capacity building. First, I would highlight the Embassy Science Fellows, puts U.S. government technical experts in foreign countries to build capacity. An example, EPA in Nigeria working on oil spill remediation. We have numerous visitor exchange programs, bring foreign delegations to the United States to observe science, technology, our science and technology enterprise. Recently had a Russian delegation, higher education officials, looking at how universities contribute to tech commercialization. And then we have some funded programs, and Linda articulated the GIST program, which would be an example of that. Fourth area would be multilaterally. OECD, APEC, ASEAN, numerous multilateral fora where you discuss international science policy. And I think bringing it together, we have a new focus in our office focused on science policy. I think when we talked in the beginning with Vaughan, you know, I think when we're engaging countries, often we focus on building a national scientific enterprise that can meet the economic, social, and development needs. And under this, instead of engaging solely on technical to technical cooperation, broadening the discussion. And we've identified 6 major policy areas that we look to engage countries on. And I think what Mary highlighted is number 1, women in science. This is a priority for Secretary Clinton. We see this as an economic empowerment and fairness issue. Second one is enhancing the public understanding and appreciation for the role of science in society. If we're going to talk about S&T for global challenges, investments in S&T, we have to have a scientifically literate society. Third, looking at principles of peer review. Many countries want to, say, have a national innovation fund or some other funding mechanism, and understanding how these processes occur is important, and CRDF does a lot of work in this area. Fourth, STEM education, science, technology, engineering, and math. Again, in this innovation ecosystem, we are looking at the next generation of innovators and entrepreneurs, and to have a sustainable scientific enterprise, you need to build the pipeline there. Fifth, science and technology for sustainable development. We just had the Rio conference. When you look at these global challenges in water, agriculture, food, they have a science and technology basis. And finally, probably the priority area where we engage is on innovation. And here we are working with countries to understand our innovation ecosystem, often focusing on R&D funding, access to capital, tech transfer, regulation like IP, clusters, and the social psychology of entrepreneurship. And I think I'll close there and open up for discussions. Thanks. Not my remarks, my speed.
In this room for a few minutes, so you can ask 40.
Just a couple of suggestions. One, extremely large number of our high school children travel to foreign countries on a regular basis, including AFS and others. I think you should start at a little lower level. That those people, you kind of schmooze your way into that sort of thing, and I use that word carefully. But certainly providing those kids with contacts once they arrive in the country, other things which don't cost you any money and are not politically influencing the activity. I think you're missing a good bet, because most of those students are STEM students for the most part. They tend to be the more intellectual of the high school group. I think that's missing a good bet. But you ought to look at that level and start a little younger. I think you're...
Can I just ask you, because I've personally felt that way, and I've tried to convince my organization to do that, but
there's at least a half a dozen other ones.
But can I ask you, do you have any advice on how you would go about doing that, or is it? I mean,
I think I have one minor suggestion. I'm not smart at all of your assets that exist around the world, but I think providing contacts for those students when they get there, or providing for the people who you have there to contact those students and say, we're here, this is what we do, can we help the school that you're going to? Because all of these kids go to a foreign school which has a science program. You have an entree, a potential entree, if it's very carefully cultivated. Very carefully cultivated. The other thing is, I think you should approach the ARCs. Have you ever heard of the ARCs? The ARCS? The ARCS is an organization of women in the country which furnishes scholarships to graduate students. And the only one that's larger is the National Science Foundation. This organization started and is run as a total nonprofit with nobody paid, all by women. We fund 5 universities in this area, but it's a national organization. I think there's some leverage there. They actually fund only U.S. students, but
I've heard of them.
I would go talk to the president of ARCS, who is well known in the area, and you may find some leverage with an extremely large number of women and students who are funded by ARCS.
Well, I think there's a real, I think all three of us and Vaughan would agree that, the whole issue of engaging the younger generation and more minorities and women is really important.
Strong recommendation. Doesn't have to be massive, it needs to be schmoozed. Okay, I use that word very carefully. You don't want the government to, use extreme caution. You know what I mean?
Well, NSF focuses a lot on young scientists. So, Jong-on, do you have any comments on that, or?
Well, there is a huge informal science education, of course, K-12 science education effort. There are sciences so international now. For the upper end, graduate students, we just announced that there's going to be the graduate research fellows will have, as part of their fellowship, an opportunity to conduct conduct research in one of 8 locations. They're calling it the GROW program. Over your graduate research opportunities worldwide. GROW, because everything at NSF has to have a cute acronym. It's in our authorizing legislation.
The difference between the
other
two
questions?
is ARCS gives the money to the students, so the university doesn't get their vigorish.
Yes, I'm also aware of it, but it also has its constraints.
Yes.
So.
I have a quick question. I was thinking of when Mary spoke that actually everyone can respond to this because it actually is duplicates. You were talking about the U.S. and how, in this case, the Iraqi women were building these relationships with the government and universities here. But one of the things I was wondering is what about, or does any of these programs do something for stressing, for example, their science relations within their own regions, with other countries and things too? I mean, building science diplomacy as a global enterprise, it's not just the U.S. I mean, we're talking about science diplomacy in broader terms. So I was wondering if you might speak to that.
Well, actually, I'm just going to say really briefly that now most of our work, a lot of it is focused on just that. It's building capacity in developing countries, particularly. We've set up small mini national science foundations. We've set up competitions where, for example, equipment competitions where we'll provide a piece of expensive equipment that a number of countries will share that serves the purpose of bringing those countries together. We did that with Armenia and Azerbaijan. So many of our programs now are focused on that. And I know, Mary, you wanted to say a few words too.
Yes, this is an area which is building in the Middle East. There are alliances and there are networks that have already begun to flourish. And 2 years ago, I was invited out through the State Department to attend a Women in Science meeting in Abu Dhabi. And there were 300 women in science and engineering drawn from across the region. And those women knew each other. They know how to get together on the internet. And so there are multiple different groups, and we want our group of Iraqi women to be a part of that network, and they are, which is good. So these things are building naturally. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Continue outside.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you.